a video that I'm actually very excited to do. I've been excited about it since I thought of the idea of doing it. I know this just says what a judgmental person I am, but the truth is this video is going to be on books that I did not particularly enjoy. And this is definitely not an exhaustive list, it's just some of the top ones that I could really think off the top of my head. And the reason why I chose specific books into this list is not because they're like objectively the worst books that I've ever read, but it's more like they're the books that have been widely acclaimed, and in some cases I think they're overrated. That's why I really wanted to express my personal opinion on them. So the case I want to make is not that these books are just horribly written or they just have no literary value at all, but I'm just expressing my personal opinion on aspects that I think these books didn't do well. I feel like especially when you're reading something that's been like very widely acclaimed, it's very annoying to feel like everyone else loves it, but I just don't get the hype or like the merit in these books, and it's very frustrating. Like, I've definitely really like doubted my own judgment and taste, but then until I reach a point in my life where I realize, oh, it's like okay to think like not see what's good in books that so many people like, because fundamentally literature is so subjective. The first book that I'm going to talk about is a wildly popular one, and it's been like adapted into television, it's won prizes, is extremely famous. So I'm going to be talking about The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what merits in it that I do recognize, because I agree it has a lot of merits. It is a very good representation of feminism. It represents a very dystopian situation. It has bold imaginations of what it could be like if we just don't constrain governmental power. It is a valuable discussion of gender and political power. I think it's very good that she's able to really clearly show how a political system functions on like different layers of oppression. So it's like the handmaids have the lowest power, but there's like the wives and there's the aunts, and then they have more power but like very limited kind of fake power. So that's how they organize their structure of power. And then there's also this focus on how the role of language shapes political power and shapes reality, a bit of like Foucauldian stuff. So in the book there's like certain words that are banned in order to kind of maintain the patriarchy's authority, because those words are often harmful to the patriarchy. It also has like a very postmodern take on reality and truth, like how the notes at the end sort of leaves room for ambiguity, and also destabilizes the authority of like Offred's narrative. So having discussed all the merits that it has, so okay, firstly, something very basic, I just didn't like the tone of the story. I know tone is like a very personal thing, but when I sincerely dislike a book, 80% of the time I dislike it for the reason that its tone really annoys me. Because it literally sounds like Offred is trying to be like detached and independent and like defiant, but also sort of like oppressed and logical and not like that emotional and passive. Like, I kind of get what she's trying to do, but the only thing it comes out to me is just, it's annoying. And besides that very personal judgment, I think the key problem of the book is that it's trying to do too much. So it's kind of like, I just said it had all these merits, like it does this and that. She's trying to like postmodernism tick, political issues tick, feminism tick, power and whatever tick. And it seems like she just pieced together all those different factors so that people could analyze it out of her. And what the story lacks, I think, is like the basic sort of fictionality that, I don't know if fictionality is a word, but the basic sort of qualities that a piece of fiction should have, which is you're telling a story. And yes, I'm not saying story as in like the linear actually like 3-part plot whatever sense, but it needs to be sort of a fiction story, mimesis, like. But when I read it, it's literally like nothing happens, it's so static, and a lot of what happens in the story seems really meaningless except to tick those boxes that she wanted to tick. So if I'm just reading it for pleasure, for not analysing it like some critic or reviewer or for English class, then there's very little pleasure I could get out of it. If I'm not like looking for all the messages and implications and techniques and whatever commentary that it's trying to give. And while I acknowledge that it's good that books try to give a lot of important messages, but it shouldn't be at such a cost that it loses its very basic function as a work of fiction. And I think this is where like Susan Sontag's essay against interpretation comes in so prominently, because there are a lot of writers, especially like in the late 20th century, they think their works are written just for the sake of being interpreted. And when we read them, we lose the ability to just enjoy that piece of work, to enjoy a piece of art without interpreting it, to just get feelings from it. Like how Sontag says we should aim for a sort of erotics of art instead of interpreting it. So I think Atwood's work completely deprived us of this ability to just enjoy it. The next one I'm going to talk about is also another very widely acclaimed writer of recent times. And this, I actually do have the book because I read it recently. Like, it was just last month that I read it. And I had such high expectations for her because of all the good stuff I've heard. And like all this like Sunday Times review and whatever on her. And then I read it and I'm just like, what am I reading? So what I'm going to show is Angela Carter, The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories. I'm going to start with why I'm disappointed. Like, read the back of this book and then it says, she can glide from ancient to modern, from darkness to luminosity, from depravity to comedy, without any hint of strain, without losing the elusive power of the original tales. And I also read somewhere else that they've commented on her saying how she is very dark and sensuous in her writing, and she completely transforms those stories with her power and gives this feminist twist, and she makes everything darker and is like writing dark fairy tales, that sort of thing. And that just really raised my expectations. But honestly, she doesn't live up to what she's promised, like, or what the reviewers promised that I would get out of her. Because her writing style, the only thing I can say is it reminds me of those teen fiction writers who really try to coat their writing with like flowery icing, like using an excessive amount of adjectives to describe an excessive amount of details in every single scene, which is totally unnecessary. And if that's what the reviewers meant by her writing is very sensual, then okay. I'm just going to give an example of the first sentence and like how much unnecessary descriptions there are. So it says, I remember how that night I lay awake in the wagon lit in a tender, delicious ecstasy of excitement, my burning cheek pressed against the impeccable linen of the pillow, and the pounding of my heart mimicking that of the great piston ceaselessly thrusting the train that bore me through the night, away from Paris, away from girlhood, away from the white enclosed quietude of my mother's apartment, into the unguessable country of marriage. Firstly, she does not have to write a tender, delicious ecstasy of excitement. She could have halved these words. It's like, just unnecessary. And if she only did it like partially at certain points in the story to create the effect, then that's fine. But it literally sounds like this throughout the entire story. And I was like dying on the inside. And if what the reviewers meant by her writing being really dark and full of like expressive female sexuality is this, I'm just gonna be like, okay, so I'm gonna read you this part. It says like, it was like about when she and her husband were about to consummate the marriage. So this is in The Bloody Chamber, by the way. The Bloody Chamber is modelled after Bluebeard, and you can Google that if you don't know what that is. So she says, and I began to shudder like a racehorse before a race, yet also with a kind of fear, for I felt both a strange impersonal arousal at the thought of love, and at the same time a repugnance I could not stifle for his white heavy flesh that had too much in common with the armful of arum lilies that filled my bedroom in great glass jars, those undertaker's lilies with the heavy pollen that powders your fingers, and as if you had dipped them in turmeric, the lilies I always associate with him, that are white and stain you. I just felt like that exceedingly long sentence was just so unnecessary. I don't know what else to say about it. It's just unnecessary. And besides her excessive writing that really annoyed me, I think another part where she didn't live up to her promise is about how her promised feminism should pan out. Because when I read The Bloody Chamber, which was meant to be a variation on Bluebeard, the only like variation is that the protagonist didn't die, which the protagonist in Bluebeard died. But the reason why she didn't die is not because she was like cunning and strategic and strong and independent, whatever. It's because her mom had this sort of weird telepathy that she was in danger and was gonna get killed. So her mom rides a horse and comes and rescues her. And there was like no foreshadowing of that. Her mom just literally comes riding in for no reason. And she doesn't do anything. She did nothing essentially to save herself. But her mom just magically comes riding on a horse. And I don't know what Carter was trying to do. Like, is she trying to like subvert the trope of the shining knight in armor to be this female motherly figure, saying women can also be this shining like knight in armor? But it was just really weird. And then the next one, like, I only tried 2 of the stories because I really couldn't go on. It was so bad. The next one, like, the courtship of Mr. Leon was modeled after Beauty and the Beast. And essentially, like, I kind of skimmed through it, but it's not that much different from the original story. So I don't know what she was doing to these fairy tales, except writing them with an excessive amount of descriptions. It's kind of funny. The next work I'm going to talk about is not something that I disliked. I think it was okay. Like, it was moderately enjoyable, it was acceptable. But considering how enormously overrated it is, I think I need to talk about it, and I need to talk about why I think it's so overrated and why it didn't really impress me. The work is Heart of Darkness. So basically, this work is a canonical work of anti-imperialism. It describes the protagonist Marlowe's journey up the Congo River in search of a man called Kurtz, who was stationed in the depths of the wilderness. So the whole work is kind of about the relationship between like capitalism, imperialism, and the relationship between civilization and the wilderness and of the sort. I think about this work, its themes are extremely interesting, and I know why it's so acclaimed is because it's one of the first to give a major treatment to this idea of the imperialist exploitation in Africa, and in particular to really truly expose kind of the wilderness inside men's hearts and how they're released when you're kind of like freed from civilization. So it talks a lot about human nature and desire and all that. So it has very, very complex themes, not just about society in general, but also about contextually their imperial exploitations and also human psyche. And I really, really appreciated all of that. However, precisely because its themes are so good, that's why I think this is a very typical case of the book itself not living up to its criticism. It's kind of like the themes and ideas of the book that these articles have extrapolated are actually not that prominent in the book itself when I read it. Like, when I read the book, it just sounded very like mediocre. Let me give an example of like a really, really good piece of criticism that I read on this piece. So there's this amazing paper called Desire in Heart of Darkness, written by Stephen Ross, and it focuses on the interaction between human desire and capitalism, and it was so insightful. So the core of this paper says that capitalism is a system built upon the infinite deferral of desire satisfaction. The way that capitalism sustains itself is that it makes everyone like defer their desires infinitely, and they're just gonna have more and more desires, and more desires are deferred, and that's how people get to like work infinitely onwards and sustain that system. Kurt's unconstrained authority in Congo and his ability to immediately satisfy all of his most primitive desires kind of breaks this mechanism that capitalism tries to reinforce, which is why he's kind of portrayed as a monster figure. And Ross, I quote, he says, Kurtz rediscovers the instincts of unfettered desire in all their violence and uncompromising demand for unmitigated, uninterrupted, and undiluted jouissance. So that's a French word. The paper goes even deeper to say how Kurtz, when the very iconic sentence he says before he dies, it was like, the horror, and then it's like he was gazing into sort of dark abyss sort of place, and he just says that and then he dies. So the paper's interpretation on that is that when one is always able to receive immediate fulfillment of desire, one really looks into the abyss of human subjectivity and sees in his final moment of extremity that jouissance and death are one and the same end of desire. And it's like how Lacan says, in the depth of the human heart is a vision of nothingness, the pure and irremediable absence at the heart of subjectivity. And these are all what I've read of that piece of criticism. So the reason why I was dissatisfied with Heart of Darkness was that it just written very mediocre, and I think the message that the critic was able to extract from it was not very prominent in the book. But the next one I'm going to be talking about is Jean Rhys's White Sargasso Sea. Rhys has written it with the intention of using it to be a prequel to Jane Eyre, and it's told mainly from Bertha Antoinette's perspective. It's about her experience of meeting and marrying Rochester in Jamaica and then eventually being taken back to England. So the intention is to provide a post-colonial perspective against the biased lenses of imperialism as represented by Bronte, where in Bronte's story, like, Bertha is completely silenced and dehumanized. So what Rhys aims to show is that Bertha isn't like naturally like that because of her status as a colonial subject, but it was Rochester who actually destroyed her sense of self through a bunch of emotional manipulation and eventual imprisonment in Thornfield. What I want to say about this book is firstly that I do appreciate its intentions. Like, it's a very good take on the representation of like imperialist values in Jane Eyre, and I think we needed that to see how some of the canonical works in English literature have been kind of sidelining all the other cultures. But here's the problem. It's like it didn't actually achieve its goal in the best possible way. So the Victorian trope of female madness is kind of invented as a response to represent society's fear of female sexuality and female anger. So women who display rage or strive for self-expression against the patriarchy are framed as mad, and often they're eventually driven mad because everyone calls them mad and like send them into asylums. So this is where the Victorian mad woman trope comes from. And I think to successfully counteract this trope, what Rhys should have done is to characterize Antoinette as someone who is very logical, clear-minded, psychologically stable, emotionally stable, not mad at all. She needs to contrast Antoinette's this internal clarity and strength with the external accusations of her madness in order to show how that trope is so unfair for women. But what Rhys actually does is shows that Bertha is mentally unstable, and she has been like that since childhood because of like all her trauma and stuff, and the narrative tone is very fragmented and confused and slips in between like dream and waking reality. It really reflects this. So this is why I don't think Rhys has achieved her goal in the best possible way, because she hasn't really defended her protagonist. She's shown that her protagonist is mentally unstable. And in correlation to this, I want to give an example of a successful way of empowering females against this trope of like the mad woman. So a while ago I watched this Korean film called The Handmaiden, and it basically employs a similar trope of female madness in its protagonist who was imprisoned and having to like read very erotic books for a bunch of like old men, and she had to marry this old man who's like her relative as well. And what she does is that although everyone else thinks she's kind of mad on the outside, in reality she's actually smart and strategic, and she plans her own escape with this female companion, and she eventually does. So her madness on the surface is actually portrayed as a sort of tactical resistance and self-protection. And so I think that's a very successful way of counteracting the mad woman trope by showing that the protagonist is actually not mad. She just seems mad in order to protect herself and help herself out of that situation. It shows how characterizing resistant and angry women as mad is a very unjust thing. So in summary, here's a wrap on those 4 works that I have discussed in this video. And if you really like any of them, definitely let me know why, because it might be able to allow me to re-examine and see what else is valuable in these works that I was not able to see before.